Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am back with a retrospective of a Ngaio Marsh novel. This time it is the 90th anniversary of Marsh's very first theater mystery, Enter a Murderer, starring Roderick Alleyn. And like I said, this is the first time Marsh sets a murder in a theater, something she would become very notable for going forward. Marsh worked in the theater a lot. It was her main passion, even more so than writing mysteries, which she is more famous for today. But in her lifetime, it was her theater contributions she was best known for, and that was even for the work she was made a Dame of the British Empire. Enter a Murderer gets its title from a stage direction from Macbeth, and I will say Macbeth and not the Scottish play because I'm not superstitious, and neither was Ngaio Marsh. Just really an excellent title, even though the play in this novel is not Macbeth. Unfortunately, that's sort of where a lot of the praise ends. This is an early Marsh novel, and I've always said her first five novels sort of lack a bit until she really hits her stride with Artists in Crime. The first five feel, a little basic, and I don't want to say amateurish, but there's like not a lot of sophistication here, especially one would expect from a queen of crime, and that we will see from her later on in her career. Enter a Murderer is clearly, to me, the middle of the first five in terms of quality. Death in Ecstasy and The Nursing Home Murder are firmly better than it, while A Man Lay Dead and Vintage Murder are firmly worse than it. But this book does turn out to be more of a mixed bag, and one that is more important to the canon and to detective fiction than I think it is like of good quality. It's not all bad either, but as a reminder, I will provide a spoiler-free summary up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which point I will let you know it's coming. Spoilers will be fair game from that point forward. Now, before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel, and join in the Discord server if you haven't already, link in the description below. Enter a Murderer begins with actor Arthur Serbonadier, not his real name, paying a visit to his uncle Jacob Saint, also not his real name. Arthur has recently been cast in the villainous role of the Beaver in the stage play The Rat and the Beaver. The problem for Arthur is that he is only an average actor, but an actor with a big ego who thinks he's the best actor around, and he really wants the role of leading man, Carruthers the Rat. That role is being played by Felix Gardner, who is a much better actor than Arthur is, and also a lot more handsome. Uncle Jacob is a bigwig in the theater world, and he has a lot of sway, so Arthur has just zero qualms about blackmailing him over something unknown to get that role. And while Uncle Jacob is not afraid of his nephew at all, it explains it just plain as day to Arthur that he's simply just not good enough to play the rat, and he was lucky to even get the role of the beaver. And Jacob Saint also knows this is partially about ego, but also over Stephanie Vaughn, who is the leading lady and to whom both Arthur and Felix are smitten with. When Arthur produces a copy of an incriminating note, Jacob softens up a bit here, but we're not really privy as to what happened after that. But we skip ahead a few weeks. The play has opened, and Arthur is still the Beaver. By the way, this is pre Leave It to Beaver, in case you were wondering. Ngaio Marsh did not steal that name from the TV show. Felix Gardner is throwing a party for the cast, and amongst the guests is young journalist Nigel Bathgate, who is personal friends with Felix from college, and a few of the cast members whom we all meet sort of like right in a row, which is really annoying. And they all ask him, what he thinks of the play, and specifically how the gun went off. And Nigel says, "Oh yes, the gun going off was very impressive," and everyone like oohs and ahs over this because the gun in the play does not actually go off. It's a prop, and someone backstage fires a real gun to get the sound right. Nigel wants to see the play again, so he brings not his wife Angela, but his bromance, Roderick Alleyn, to the Unicorn, which is the first of many animal named theaters in an Ngaio Marsh novel. Skip ahead a few more weeks, and Arthur Serbonadier is still hung up over Stephanie Vaughn, and he visits her in her flat where he proposes marriage, to which she rejects him because she is more in love with Felix, naturally. Arthur is not happy and grabs her, and he apparently looked more evil than he ever had before, but Felix shows up and interrupts this. On the night Nigel takes Alan to the play, they go backstage to meet with Felix. They also meet, well, quite frankly, they meet a lot of people who wind up not mattering, but they meet Felix and old Blair of the Doorman, and Marsh, as is her forte, really depicts the backstage area of a theater with such vivid and pithy descriptions, you really feel like you're there. But Alan is a bit overwhelmed by all this. You know, he's a fan of the theater and the arts, and this is his first time being backstage behind the scenes. You have to remember this is still single Alan pre Agatha Troy, where he has a thing for actresses that will become apparent later. Also, weirdly, Alan mentions that he's equally famous as actor Felix Garner, which I don't know why this is a thing, but like all of these golden age detectives are famous in universe. You have like Poirot, Holmes, Nero Wolfe, or at least like the professional detectives, and many amateur ones are sort of like famous in their worlds. It's just so bizarre a detective would be famous to me. Like, I can't name any famous detectives today who are a real person. But anyway, Alan meets Felix and Stephanie Vaughn, and also J. Barclay Cramer, who plays the butler, and he was supposed to play the beaver, and but of course Arthur got that. And Cramer very angry and suspicious over that. And you know what? Arthur is also very angry and suspicious because he's jealous of Alan and how handsome he is, and Alan's going to swoop Stephanie right off her feet. He's also clearly drunk. By the way, Alan's flirting with Stephanie Vaughn is talking about mystery novels. He recommends Edmund Wilson, which, you know, certainly a choice. By the way, talking obsessively about mystery novels is not good flirting technique. Don't ask me how I know that. But it's very clear Arthur is not only jealous of Felix, he's just very confrontational and egotistical in general. Alan absolutely loves the play, which, to be honest, sounded absolutely awful to me. Like the brief glimpse we get of it. The Rat and the Beaver is some kind of like mystery slash gangster slash drug smuggling play. It's not entirely clear to me what it is, but it gives Alan the quote, oodle boodles, whatever that is. Google was not helpful there. When the final climactic scene arrives, Felix, the rat Carruthers, is on stage with his mistress, played by Janet Emerald, and his mother, played by veteran actress Susan Max. Sir Bonadier, the beaver, comes in on stage and a conflict erupts. The audience is hooked by the drama, the women all fascinated by the charming Felix Gardner. The beaver wields a gun, and a fight ensues between him and the rat. The rat seizes control of the gun and shoots the villainous beaver dead. The crowd erupts, but Alan goes pale. Alan is called backstage, and Nigel follows, where they find Arthur Bonadier dead. That excellent performance of his death scene was not an act, after all, and neither was Felix Garner's shocked look at having shot him. You know, the obvious, like, real life comparison to this story is the very recent and famous Alec Baldwin Helena Hutchinson incident on the set of Rust. There's a lot of connective tissue between that incident and the murder in this novel. Again, not to make commentary on that or anything, but you know, the quick order is when Felix shot Arthur during the play, the prop gun fired a real bullet. And according to stage manager George Simpson, the cartridge in the prop gun cannot fire a bullet. And it was only there for a dramatic effect when Arthur like loads the gun up on stage. Simpson put the gun on the desk on the stage during the second act, and so it was there during the third. He said there was nothing else in the drawer at the time but the cartridge, and no one could have switched it afterward. The cartridge was made by Props, who is, you know, the appropriately named prop master. Allen calls in his crew of Bailey and Thompson, and in making his debut appearance, Inspector Fox. Although it does appear Bailey, the fingerprint man, is Allen's second in command here, but Felix is naturally worried he will get blamed for this, to which Allen says, yeah, probably, I don't know the law. You know, it's a very dry sense of humor from him in this novel. Alan wants to learn what happened backstage before the play, but is constantly interrupted by temperamental actors who want to go home. Namely, Janet Emerald tries to sneak into her dressing room when she was told not to. But there was a blackout backstage, and everybody was just sort of like moving around. Ngaio Marsh is probably best known, in addition to her mystery novels, for her theatrical work. She was made a dame specifically for her theatrical contributions, not her literary works, for which she is best known today. But the theater mysteries are her specialty, and she depicts the theater so well, and actors so well, but I do think she sometimes runs into a problem where she knows the theater so well. I think she thinks everyone else knows it as well as she does. And I did run into that problem in this novel where I think you do need some theater knowledge to understand everything that's going on. It's not like required to understand the book, but I think it would help a lot. And I've read this book, I don't know, dozens of times, and there are still things that give me pause that I don't quite understand. But Jacob Saint arrives and is angry about the investigation. He suggested it was suicide because Arthur was drunk and angry and he was about to be fired from the play, but Alleyn just does not buy that. Saint is very protective of Janet Emerald, who is also not at all helpful about anything. She's over dramatic and just wants to go home, but very strangely, she claims that not only did she not see Simpson put the prop cartridge in the desk drawer, but she also claims she never even thought about the cartridge when it was previously said she was obsessed over it. So that's strange. And Janet also suggests that Felix is the murderer and did it on purpose because the gun used is actually his. It's his brother from the war, and it was with him most of the time. Alan asks for Susan Max. She is a veteran actress with a little hint of Miss Marple in her. You know, she's observant and she knits as part of her character, and she really does knit. Alan holds a lot of respect for her as an actress, and she recalls like all kinds of small events. Alan wants to locate the missing dummy cartridge, and he and Nigel discover that pretty quickly, right in the desk drawer where it was supposed to be. So somebody switched it probably when the lights went out, but somebody didn't want Alan to find that cartridge. And that person is the man who made the cartridge, Props, the prop master, who sort of attempts to kill Alan by dropping a chandelier on him. Very stage play like of him, Phantom of the Opera. But Prop says he did not kill Sir Bonadir. He just hated him so much that he wants his killer to get away with it, whoever they are. And, you know, Alan actually thinks that makes a lot of sense. Arthur was apparently seeing Trixie Beadle, whom Props was also seeing. Trixie is also a dresser for Stephanie Vaughn and the daughter of Felix's dresser. We also see our first bit of tension between Nigel and Fox when they disagree about whether or not Props is innocent. Nigel thinks he is because the chandelier thing was silly and didn't match the brains behind the murder, when Fox thinks Props is guilty because you wouldn't do that otherwise. Alan's interview with Felix Gardner doesn't reveal much at all, and Felix seems more upset that he thinks Stephanie will think he shot Arthur on purpose and he will lose her, rather than like people thinking he's a killer. Felix doesn't really say much except that during the blackout, a man bumped into him in the hallway, which is when the cartridges were probably switched. Alan keeps looking for gloves used to avoid fingerprints on the cartridge, and while Felix has gloves, those weren't the ones used. He does find a pair of men's gray gloves in a knit bag prop used by Susan Max, and these gloves have the same scent on them used by Jacob Saint, which is also found in the cartridge itself. There's also some kind of like a white residue powder on them and on the glove, which is the wet white used in stage makeup. The final interview is with Stephanie Vaughn, and she says after Alan left her backstage, Arthur Bonadir assaulted her and left a bruise on her shoulder. Alan is a little bit skeptical here because Stephanie said Arthur struck her from the front, but the bruise is more consistent with someone coming up from behind her and grabbing her. And this very strangely gets a little flirty between Alan and Miss Vaughn with all the touching that's happening, which they both seem to enjoy. It's very strange given the context here. The next day, Alan receives a visit from Jacob Saint's fired footman, who wants to spill the beans because he's angry his boss fired him. He actually wants money, but Alan just tells him to get on with it. Basically, the footman overheard that earlier conversation between Arthur and his uncle, in which Jacob Saint promised his nephew the lead in the next play, because he couldn't switch out Felix at this point, but Arthur was not happy about it. The footman also says that Jacob's will left mostly everything to his nephew Arthur, but if Arthur died before Jacob Saint, everything goes to Janet Emerald. And it's not looking good for Miss Emerald because in addition to her odd behavior and lies, she now has a financial motive. The footman also mentions that Saint has been doing business with a man known to be involved in drug smuggling because, of course he is. This is an early Ngaio Marsh novel. There has to be drug smuggling. Allen recalls a libel case from a couple years past in which Jacob Saint sued a newspaper and won. The newspaper had published an article claiming Saint's fortune had come from drug smuggling, but the author whose name appeared in the byline actually did not write it and claimed his signature was forged. And it was never discovered who forged the article. Allen actually suspects that either Felix Gardner or Arthur Strabonadier, because the article was submitted from a small town near Cambridge where both Felix and Arthur were studying, as well as Nigel, who confirms all of this. While Nigel meets with the reporter thinks it's Arthur because Arthur would know Saint's financial situation, and since the two were always fighting, it might have been like a blackmail on Arthur's part. In fact, later on, Felix tells Nigel that he knows it's Arthur because Felix encouraged Arthur to write the article because they were both apparently stoned out of their minds on heroin. And for what it's worth, Saint denies the allegations and also suggests Arthur committed suicide yet again because he was the one who put the cartridges in the gun as part of the play. Allen brings Nigel and Fox to search Strabonadier's flat. Allen naturally makes a lot of really snide comments about how ugly the apartment is and what awful taste in decor Arthur had, purple and orange with a satinwood desk. Allen very quickly finds loads of just unpaid bills over a year old and drugs, because of course he does. He recognizes these drugs as the packages dealt by Sniffy Quarles, which, what a fantastic name for a drug dealer, Sniffy Quarles. But Allen also discovers a cache of letters, most of which are from Stephanie Vaughn, but there are others, most notably one from Trixie the dresser Arthur was seeing, basically admitting to getting him the drugs and how her boyfriend and father are unhappy with her. It's unclear if she actually knows she's getting him drugs. There's also just like a lot of newspapers and articles about Jacob Saint's libel case, and very oddly, there is blotting paper where it appears Arthur had practiced forging the reporter's signature. And what's strange about this is that article was written years ago, so like, why would he still have this? Allen gets rid of Fox and Nigel quickly because he wants to call Stephanie Vaughn and tell her about the letters. Nigel thinks there's a romantic eye on Allen, and he's partially right. Allen phones Miss Vaughn and tells her to meet him at Arthur's flat at 9 o'clock, and as Allen assumed, Stephanie Vaughn had her own key to Arthur's flat and arrived early to abscond with the letters. He catches her, but they have a pretty frank conversation about the letters in which she admits to getting involved in a bad crowd, but that was just all a long time ago. But Arthur threatened to show the letters to Felix. And because Allen is falling head over heels in love with her, he lets her keep the letters, but one is missing. At least she claims there is. It isn't with the others. But she also says that the wet white that was found on the cartridge was from her room, but Arthur had spilled it all over the place. And this conversation also gets very flirty on both ends. Allen kisses her hand. She enjoys it. She wants him to kiss her again, which he does not do. But he even calls her Stephanie instead of Miss Vaughn. Ooh la la. While this is happening, Nigel is meeting with Felix, and while Nigel is at Felix's flat, he receives a threatening note, that would be Felix, mentioning he could have hurt more than his sore foot. After the inquest is adjourned, Nigel again pays another visit to Felix, where he interrupts an argument between Felix and Stephanie Vaughn, in which she tells Felix, quote, "If I did do it, I did it for you," unquote, which Nigel takes as a confession, but Allen just laughs at him when Nigel tells him about it, because Allen has more or less solved this case already, but he has still some ways to go. But he tells Nigel that Jacob Saint is about to be arrested, for initially what's going to look like smuggling drugs, but he's sort of vague about it here. He doesn't want Nigel to surmise the truth here, but he wants Nigel to tell all his friends about the arrest, but not mention why. Also, conveniently, Allen does not tell Nigel why, but again, sort of letting the implication being Saint's being arrested for murder. But Saint is just so riled up and angry over this that he actually winds up having a heart attack, but he'll live. Props, the prop master, tried to visit Allen, but Allen was busy, so he left a note telling Allen that he arrested the wrong person. Remember here, the public knowledge is that Saint was arrested for murder. We, the reader, assume he's being arrested for the drug smuggling, but in universe they think it's for the murder. Alleyn has had Detective Thompson shadow Props since the murder happened, but Props dropped the chandelier. Ever since Props dropped the chandelier, in fact, we find out that everyone is actually being shadowed. Thompson reported that after leaving Scotland Yard, Props phoned someone in a public call box, but the operator couldn't get the number when Thompson asked for it. He then followed Props to the Unicorn, where he is presumably meeting with the murderer to warn them. Thompson lost track of Props, but when he went to call Alleyn a second time. Meanwhile, Bailey has the fingerprint report. Anonymous letter that Felix received only has fingerprints from Felix and Nigel, as expected. The typewriter at the Unicorn was tested on the night of the murder and only had Felix and Props' fingerprints on it, but when it was tested again, all of the fingerprints were wiped off except for Felix's on the letter Q key. And we know that Felix, when he's on stage, he's supposed to be typing as part of the act, but he just presses the Q key over and over and over again. So that makes sense. And Alleyn and Fox then head to the Unicorn, where Marsh writes this really lengthy scene of Alleyn and Fox sort of like stealthily sneaking around the back areas of the Unicorn. This was giving like major Scooby-Doo chase scene vibes in the best of ways, but they eventually come across Props, who is hanging from a rafter. It appears to be suicide, but Alleyn knows this is murder, mainly because he already knows everything, but also because the area around Props has been cleaned after he hangs, so someone else was there. And this is where I end the spoiler-free section, so back out now if you need to. You have been warned. Alan asks one of the sergeants what happened, and he says that he lost track of the person he was supposed to be shadowing, who is not named, which is a bit irritating and not playing fair. Alan has this idea to reenact the night of the murder, and this is something he does often in these early novels that, to be honest, isn't the most interesting thing. But he has the cast and crew reenact all their movements, beginning with the first scene of the final act, and nothing happens. So Alan knows the cartridges had already been switched by then. Alan then has everyone move around backstage, going the places they did and doing the same things. Of course, Props and Subranadir are missing, but Alan has planned for that. He then asks George Simpson to climb up to the rafters, but Simpson is too afraid, so Felix does it, and then Felix shouts that Props has hanged himself, to which Alan asks, how does Felix know it's Props? Fox then arrests Felix for the murder of Arthur, Subranadir, and Props. Everyone else goes home except for Alan, Nigel, and Stephanie Vaughn. Miss Vaughn is upset, but Alan tries to console her by saying that she doesn't need Felix, very clearly hoping she will say she needs Alan, but she doesn't. She then asks Alan when he realized it was Felix, and he said it wasn't immediately, but he strongly suspected by the bruise on her shoulder. She lied about how it happened by saying that Arthur struck her, but Alan recognized the bruise was formed by someone grabbing her shoulder from behind. And Alan remembered when Arthur had barged into her dressing room drunk and screaming that Felix had his hand on Stephanie's shoulder, and that bruise was formed by Felix growing so angry with Arthur that he left the mark on her shoulder. Alan realized if Felix was so angry as to cause that bruise, it was certainly possible that he was angry enough to kill Arthur. Alan sends Miss Vaughn home in a taxi and tells the rest to Nigel, which is actually pretty short. Like, we don't have a particularly long explanation here, but Alan, despite what he said earlier, really was on to Felix almost immediately. As per my meta clues, Alan says Felix was the person in position to commit the murder and make sure it happened. And while anyone could have switched the cartridges, only Felix could have made sure the trigger was pulled. And although everyone knew that Felix would pull the trigger during the play because he always did, anything could have gone wrong if Felix wasn't in the know. He might not have pulled the trigger that night, or he might have played around with it earlier and pulled the trigger earlier than he should have. Also, when Alan reenacted everyone's movements, no one ran into Felix, as he claimed, which means he was lying about someone else's movements, and when everyone else was there where they're supposed to be, but, the final nail was Felix yelling about Props hanging when Alan had moved Props' body to hide the discovery and then replaced Props with a heavy bag. So when Felix went up and said it was Props, he could only have known that if he had murdered props, because it wasn't props, it was just a sandbag or something. But why did Felix do this? Well, Felix was the one who wrote that article about Jacob Saint. Alleyn never believed it was Arthur because Arthur had everything to lose. And also, Alleyn found it strange that Arthur had this practice paper with all the signatures on it. Like, why would he have such incriminating evidence from something years ago? It doesn't work out. Felix wrote that article because he was angry with Jacob Saint for getting him involved in the drug trade, and he was heavily involved with it, but not merely a user like he told Nigel. Arthur knew this and began blackmailing Felix by threatening to tell Stephanie Vaughn, who would then leave him, and then threatened to tell Jacob Saint, who would certainly have him removed as the lead of the play and give it to Arthur. Feeling angry and desperate, Felix decided to murder Arthur. During the blackout, he went to Stephanie's dressing room to put the gloves where he got them covered in wet white, and then raced onto the stage to switch the cartridges, where he ran into no one. However, Props knew what Felix was up to, as he witnessed this, and he knew Felix well. Props was willing to keep the secret, but not at the stake of an innocent man when Jacob Saint was arrested. So Felix killed him when Props confronted him about it. The anonymous note Felix received was typed by Felix when he used the typewriter during the play, in what is a very good clue, probably my favorite from this novel. We're told repeatedly that Felix only types the letter Q over and over again, and when on the stage, yet the typewriter had Felix's fingerprints over all of the keys. And then the letter, later on, these had been wiped away except for the letter Q. The novel ends with Nigel being mildly annoyed by Alleyn and him keeping all this a secret from him, but Alleyn explains that Nigel was friends with Felix and he didn't know if Nigel would say anything to him, either inadvertently or advertently. The end. Now let's get into some praise. To be honest, I really don't have a lot of specific pieces of praise for this novel, and I don't mean for that to be interpreted as there's nothing redeeming about this novel, because there is. I think the plot and the concept are extremely intriguing and well executed. It's very creative, and I love how Marsh uses her knowledge of the theater to her benefit in the execution of this crime. One can't help but to make comparisons to the Alec Baldwin, Helena Hutchins situation on the set of Rust, which, again, not to make a commentary on that situation, but I think because that situation happened, this novel, I think, maybe rings a little more prevalent than it had. I immediately thought of this novel when I first heard the news of that event. Again, not making commentary on the real life situation, but I think the situation made this novel feel very real and exciting. The mechanics of the plot are very well executed, very creative. It's a very unique sort of plot, not rehashing things done before. Now, Ngaio Marsh will reuse this twist of, the person who physically committed the murder but appears to have been set up really was the murderer the whole time. She will use that many times very quickly, but this is the first time she uses it, so again, not a knock here. I would credit Enter a Murderer for launching the theater as a popular setting for murder mysteries. It is one of the more iconic settings. Now, it's certainly not the first theater mystery, and we had like the Roman Hat mystery and others before that, but I would say this is the novel that really launched that into being like a thing. And I think one reason for that is because Ngaio Marsh knows the theater, and when previous authors had used the theater, they came across as more like ignorant of how the stage worked and the nuances of it and the people who work there. I think the actor characters are well depicted here to be very realistic. That I think actors tend to be, sometimes they're little like chaotic figures in these books. They do come across as real people here rather than like melodramatic caricatures. Overall, I think this novel does a lot of things well. I wouldn't say it does a lot of things extraordinarily well. It's very like mystery writing 101, nailing all of the basics, but not doing much outside of that. I'll also say a lot of the flaws I think this book has were ameliorated for me on this reread. I did not think those flaws were as detrimental as I had previously thought. As for criticism, I ranked this book number 21 of 32 Alleyn novels, and I would lower that, not because my opinion went down. My opinion of this book actually went up on this reread, but I just think 21 was a little high to begin with, and I remember thinking that at the time I made that video. I think somewhere in like the 25, 26 range is probably more appropriate. It should definitely be below Off with His Head, Dead Water, Death and Ecstasy for sure. I've heard from some of you who say When in Rome is too low. And as I alluded to under the praise section, this book is like mystery writing 101, where Marsh demonstrates like the basic skills, but not much beyond that. This book is very short. My edition is about 170 pages long, and it feels it. There just isn't enough going on here. And while I do appreciate March like not padding the story out with obvious and irrelevant filler material, I do think the potential was there to expand the story without having to do that. Mainly with the characters. I mean, there are a lot of characters in this novel who are just there, like Susan Max, Janet Emerald, J. Barclay Cramer, the two dressers, even like Dulcie Deemer, who is a character I didn't even mention in the summary because she's just not that useful in the story. But all of these people are there and they don't really do anything. I think they're depicted fine, but they don't do enough. Even the bigger characters like Felix and Stephanie and Arthur really had a lot more to give that just wasn't used. This book leaves me wanting more. Even with the mystery itself, like I think the mechanics and the cluing are good, but give me more of that. There just isn't enough here. Now, this book is solvable, but I still wanted more, and there was room and potential for it. And to be constructive, I think this novel should have come with some kind of map or chart of the stage and the back area for people who are not familiar with how a theater looks like or how it works. I do think Marsh does a bit of assuming everyone knows as much about the theater as she does. There are some fair play issues, such as us not being informed which character the constable was supposed to be trailing. Again, I have to bring up the drug issues here. Marsh can get very preachy about drugs. They felt so forced into this story, and I think the novel would have just been better keeping it like a purely domestic sort of suspense type mystery and not involving drug smuggling. Like, she does this so often. It comes across as very preachy, like drugs are bad. Yeah, we know, we get it. And I also have to mention that this book spoils the murderer from A Man Lay Dead by name for absolutely no reason, which is not great. Overall, I enjoy the story, but it does the bare minimum and nothing beyond the bare minimum. It doesn't have a lot of flaws, but because there just isn't a lot to praise, I do think the final product is far below average for a Roderick Alleyn novel, and we know Marsh can and does do better. It's like this novel feels very like first drafty, like in the sense that it's not fully fleshed out. Like the ideas are all fleshed out. It's just the writing itself. There's just not enough things going on. There needed to be more happening here, and it just wasn't happening. Onto the characters, starting with Roderick Alleyn. And whereas the one-time characters are a little flat and lackluster, I think this is a good novel for the recurring characters. We see a new side to Roderick Alleyn in this book. This is, I would say, technically the first novel where he's the star. I would say Nigel is the star of A Man Lay Dead. And Alan was a lot of fun here. We learn a lot more about Alan, personally, his, like, bromance with Nigel, his friendships with Fox and Bailey, his love life. I think the Alan of this novel is the Alan I think a lot of people commonly think of. Handsome Alan, is his nickname. This very eligible bachelor who is powerful, rich, and handsome. He has like women throwing themselves at him, and he has an affinity for actresses like Stephanie Vaughn. He is very gentlemanly, and his feelings for Miss Vaughn do conflict with his career, and he does put his career first, which is why he doesn't wind up with Stephanie Vaughn. But they do have a brief fling that I suppose went no further than kissing. I guess we don't know for sure. They were alone in a flat together for some time. The scandal. I also think we saw a lot more of how Alan investigates in this novel and his thought processes and him like piecing things together more so than we did in the previous novel. Overall, this is a strong novel for Alan. There are better, but there are also a lot worse. And we have Nigel Bathgate, who is still a major character at this point. Again, definitely a lot of fun with his like bromance with Alan, going to the theater together, and Alan excluding Nigel from pretty much everything fun because he doesn't want Nigel to blab to Felix. We see a bit of a smarter Nigel here as he is able to make his own deductions. he's a little more confident in himself, but is also completely played by smarter minds like Alan and even Felix, who really run roughshod over him and openly deceive him because, they know Nigel is quote unquote a good old sausage. That is a line from the novel, whatever that means. We don't actually see his wife Angela in this book, but she is mentioned, so there's a bit of good continuity with A Man Lay Dead, but this is one of these novels where Nigel is Alan's second in command. There was a lot of fun banter between Nigel and Fox, with Fox more or less taking offense at Nigel's newfound position. But overall, another really strong novel for Nigel. We also have Inspector Fox in his debut novel. The narration describes him as just like Alan's old nanny, being very protective of his boss. And we see this quite a bit where Fox is the one always putting himself in the most dangerous position over Alan, seemingly by choice. There is a clear but mild dislike of Nigel, with Fox constantly contradicting everything Nigel says and also having explaining Alan to Nigel as if they were strangers. And it's funny how Fox and Nigel's argument over whether or not Props is innocent or not winds up in both of them being correct. Fox is correct in the sense that Props was basically an accomplice, but Nigel is correct in the sense that Props did not commit the murder. But overall, Fox really did not have a large role here. It would be expanded into the future. We also have Sergeant Bailey, the fingerprint man. Usually Bailey is more of a background character. He's always there. He does the fingerprints in all the novels, but he plays a bigger role here than normal. Not much of note, to be honest, but worth mentioning. He's someone whom Alan bounces ideas off of, but not someone I would say he trusts as much as he does either Nigel or Fox. But at this point in the series, it does feel like Bailey is more like the second in command to Alan than Fox would. And I think this is something Marsh changes right in the next novel, where it is Fox who is the second command. And again, it's not like something happened in universe where Fox got promoted. He has the same title. It's just that Marsh started preferring Fox over Bailey and then Nigel, and eventually she writes off Nigel completely. Our murderer is Felix Gardner. He actually did make my top 10 Ngaio Marsh murderers, which I probably would not make that choice again, but I still think there's a lot of merit to his character. I like how devious he is and how crafty he is. The way he gaslights Nigel and the way he sets up Arthur as the forger and blackmailer. It's that sort of craftiness that put him on that list in the first place. But after rereading this novel, I have to be honest, he probably does not make the top 10 list. But I think because I think there are issues in his character. I would have liked to have seen more of him, more of the gaslighting, more of the shiftiness, just more of that, which is basically the thing that sums up this novel. I think Felix is a good character, but there was potential for him to be an all-time great character. Instead, we just sort of get this run-of-the-mill sort of character. Our main victim is Arthur Serbanadier, one of many jerk victims. He's, again, another, fine character. I liked how Marsh depicted him as, an egomaniac, but one that isn't a caricature or over the top. But also, like Felix, I wish there was just more of him and, an expanded personality. We do know Arthur is, an okay actor. Felix is better. Felix is handsomer, but Arthur makes do. He felt, very middle of the road, not having, a lot of issues, but nothing, really standing out either. Again, I would have liked to have seen this character expanded quite a bit, a lot of development with him, a lot more nuanced. And again, I think that's some of the trouble with Ngaio Marsh when she inserts drugs into the story, because that the drugs just becomes their whole thing, and it's just he's a fine character. He could have been a lot better. The potential was there for it. As for our other victim, Props, he was just kind of there, not much going on until he gets murdered. I mean, the only thing notable is that he dropped the chandelier on Alan, or almost on Alan. There just, wasn't enough character work here to make Props stand out or make the reader care about him. Almost certainly, probably one of the worst victims from Ngaio Marsh. Just, really nothing going on here at all. Onto our regular characters, we have Stephanie Vaughn, Alan's smitten interest of the novel. She was fine. To be honest, I did not really see what was so alluring about her that she had all these men, even Alan, after her. She's such a thin character, and she doesn't do or say anything that makes me understand this charm of hers. I find her boring, to be honest, and also just inconsistent. She's giving like a lot of sympathy at times, but also Nigel thinks she's a murderer and vindictive. She was all over the board, and I just never really found her all that interesting or even like understood her character, which is a shame because Marsh is so good at depicting actresses, especially, but just simply not with Stephanie Vaughn. Jacob Saint is sort of the same thing. He was just kind of there and someone who is also inconsistent. I think, sort of unintentionally, he comes off as likable in the way he handles Arthur, even though I think that scene is supposed to expose his evil, ruthless side. It's a lot of tell and no show with him, which, to be honest, I'm not like the biggest subscriber of the rule show over tell, but this needed some show here. Like, his arrest was supposed to be this big, dramatic, climactic turning point for the novel, but it just isn't because the reader is not invested in Jacob Saint, and also the reader is more or less primed already that he's not being arrested for the murder but for the drugs. It just wasn't that interesting. His relationship with Janet Emerald was also like a lot of nothing going on. Like, Marsh sets this relationship up for something and then just does nothing with it. Like, it doesn't make any sense why she would do that. Then there's Susan Max, veteran actress whom Alan has a lot of respect for. She's actually a recurring character. We will see her again in Vintage Murder, which is sort of strange considering she's basically invisible in this novel. But she is definitely someone Alan can rely on to tell the truth and be observant. I like how her knitting on stage isn't an act. She really is knitting in comparison to Felix's typing, which is him pressing the Q key over and over again, which must be noticeable to the audience. I think Susan Max provides a clue at one point where she mentions the rug on the stage is like scrunched up against the door and it prevents her exit. I think this is a clue, and I say think because it's never explained or mentioned by Alan in his summation, so I'm not really sure. But what I think it indicates is that someone had entered the stage after it had been set up when they weren't supposed to. Again, that's not explained. I think that's a clue. And finally, we have Janet Emerald, who, again, is just there, the supporting actress of the cast. She was melodramatic and emotional. She actually is set up to be the prime suspect with her inheriting from Jacob Saint, and once Arthur is dead, and she's constantly lying about her actions and observations, but just nothing came from it. But I just did not find her a strong character or an interesting personality. She did not come across to me as a likely murderer just from her lack of page time and lack of development as a character. Janet Emerald here, final character I'm going to talk about in this video. There are quite a few others, but like they're just not even in the book enough for me to discuss. And like some of these characters also, like Janet Emerald is not that prevalent in this book, despite being the initial prime suspect, and all these other characters just appear even less so. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about Enter a Murderer from Ngaio Marsh, her second novel, celebrating 90 years in 2025. Now, next week, we have our final subgenre deep dive of the year. That will be the courtroom mystery. A little different here, time mystery ones we don't actually see all that often, but I will discuss all about the courtroom mystery, what happens, what they are, etc. I also want to wish everyone a very happy Thanksgiving this Thursday coming up, Thursday the 27th, if you are watching this live, and if you are watching this many weeks or months or years later, still happy Thanksgiving anyway, because why not? Until next time, Mystery Files.